The revelation of Baha'u'llah, whose supreme mission is none other but the achievement of this organic and spiritual unity of the whole body of nations, should, if we be faithful to its implications, be regarded as signalizing through its advent the coming of age of the entire human race. It should be viewed not merely as yet another spiritual revival in the ever-changing fortunes of mankind, not only as a further stage in a chain of progressive revelations, nor even as the culmination of one of a series of recurrent prophetic cycles, but rather as marking the last and highest stage in the stupendous evolution of man's collective life on this planet. Shoghi Effendi. So now I'll introduce our speaker for today, and just a reminder to save your questions until after the talk when we'll have time for our Q&A session. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I'll put in the chat now. Our speaker this week is Dr. Stephen Worth, and his topic is Humanity's Coming of Age, Implications for Individuals, Communities, and Institutions. Stephen brings two things to the table: engaging creativity and over 40 years of experience in agricultural and rural development in Africa. He has worked in agricultural extension and development as a field practitioner and manager, and has consulted with numerous agencies on capacity development, wealth creation, rural development, and agricultural extension and education. He recently retired as an associate professor in agricultural extension and rural resource management at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, where he also served as director of the African Center for Food Security. Previously, he served as academic leader, teaching and learning, and later as acting dean and head of the School of Agricultural, Earth, and Environmental Sciences. Stephen has developed and presented numerous training programs on agricultural and rural development, and co-authored and edited training manuals, occasional papers, and books with the FAO, and has authored and co-authored over 40 published peer-reviewed articles. He has evaluated and developed curricula for numerous agricultural education programs, particularly in higher education. He has been the principal writer of several South African national policies in agricultural extension and agricultural education and training. Most recently, he assisted the FAO with developing programming framework for South Africa and setting up a farm business school system in Azerbaijan, including training of extension personnel as trainers and facilitators. In his retirement, Stephen is pursuing a range of work with the South African government, the FAO of the UN, and UKZN, providing expert advice on agricultural education and training, policy development, and institutional evaluations. He remains active in research and postgraduate supervision. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Worth.
So good afternoon to you. It's evening to us here. The sun has just set here in South Africa. And we are, of course, in the middle of winter, so it's quite cold. We do not have insulated houses or double glazed windows or central heating. So we all live a lot with blankets to try and stay warm. And I'm a little embarrassed by that introduction. I don't know how that qualifies me for this presentation, but I will do my best to share some insights that I have gathered from reading the writings of Baha'u'llah and his Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi on this subject. I don't have control on my slide program as I had a challenge on my side, so Bayan is going to help me. So I guess we start with the first slide. And so I want to thank everybody for joining in this discourse on humanity's coming of age. It's really an interesting subject, and it's rather vast, and one which, at least for me, provides a great deal of reassurance about the future of our planet and of human society. And I want to thank the Pahami family for inviting me to share some thoughts on this subject. Go to the next slide. To give some perspective, actually, before I start this, I want to just thank my son Cunningham, who helped me think through this presentation. He's a Baha'i living out on the West Coast in Oregon, and he was quite instrumental in getting my thoughts clear on this. So to give this presentation some context, it will be helpful to have at least a little understanding of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. And even that needs some context. Those of you who have attended one of my presentations in the past may recognize this introduction, or at least parts of it, so please forgive the repetition. All of us have grown up with some form of ideology. Generally, we either believe or do not believe in God, and those who believe in God have varying understandings of that concept. Next slide. Baha'is believe that there has only ever been one God, who is the creator of all that is. He is called by many different names and is worshipped, or not, in many different ways. Next. Baha'is also believe that that one God created us from the same stock. Thus, in essence, all of humanity, with all its diversity of language, race, gender, culture, body type, and mentality, with all of its diversity, humanity is one people, essentially one family with God as our collective parent. Next. So, one God, one people. And thus, this one God has been educating this one people for thousands of years. Next. From the Baha'i perspective, God has taken us through many stages of development, physically, socially, politically, and spiritually. In the time of Adam, we were like infants, just discovering the uniqueness of our creation as something similar to, but distinct from, animals. We were developing our sense of individual wholeness, where we see ourselves as an integrated whole, created in the image of God. We started the process of understanding the power and consequences of free will, which is our power of choice. Next. Through the ages, as we have very slowly matured, God would send a special educator to help us achieve the next stage in our individual and collective development. We know some of these educators: Abraham, Moses, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, Christ, Muhammad. And now we have Baha'u'llah, who is the educator from God for our time. Next. Each of these educators brought essentially two sets of lessons from God. One set was pretty much the same, spiritual truths that will never change. The Baha'i writings refer to these as the development of moral principles and the quickening of the conscience of man. And they explain that these are essential or fundamental, one and the same in all religions, changeless and eternal. Reality, not subject to transformation. There is a God. He is all-powerful. He is the creator of all things. He is the source of all knowledge. He is the source of all love. What makes us human is that we have immortal soul, an immortal irrational soul, for a time, which is associated with the physical frame. Fundamental virtues of love, respect, truthfulness, trustworthiness, courtesy, humility, and so many others. These are all some of the essential teachings from all the religions, from all the educators from God. As recorded in the Baha'i writings, all the divine prophets and messengers were the instruments and channels of this same eternal, essential truth. Next. The other set of lessons are those which relate to the material affairs of humankind. Lessons about how we should order our individual and collective lives. They are subject to change in each day of manifestation according to the exigencies of the time, conditions, and different capacities of humanity. Next. In brief, the Baha'i writings tell us every one of the divine religions contains essential ordinances which are not subject to change, and material ordinances which are abrogated according to the exigencies of the time. This duality of revelation is one of the keys to understanding the Baha'i perspective on humanity's coming of age. Next. Consider this. When a child is born, it is by design destined to become an adult. In the animal aspect of human beings, this is a biological process that is an inevitability for the majority of babies born. They are able to trace the physical changes in the child on many fronts: height, weight, physical coordination, mental development, language development, sexual maturity. In a biological sense, for animals, sexual maturity generally marks the arrival of adulthood or the physical coming of age. But for humans, coming of age is much more complex. Coming of age refers to a number of aspects in the development of a human being. It often refers to legally becoming an adult or being allowed to engage in activities reserved for adults, like voting and entering into marriage. I'm sure you were thinking of some others. Socially, it often refers to a point in the development of a child where he or she takes on the responsibilities of an adult. The specifics of coming of age vary from culture to culture. Some have formal ceremonies or informal rites of passage. The Jewish bar and bat mitzvahs, the Amish Rumspringa, the Hispanic Consiera, the Xhosa initiation of boys, and the Zulu Umalelo for girls. Next slide. In the process of coming of age, the adolescent child faces a whole range of issues. Things like self-discovery and identity formation, peer relationships and comparisons, autonomy and independence, moral and ethical development, family conflict, self-esteem issues, emotional vulnerability, responsibility and decision-making, social and cultural expectations. Overall, the overall process of transitioning from childhood to adulthood can be challenging and overwhelming as individuals navigate various changes and uncertainties. Next slide. So, how does this fit into humanity's coming of age? Well, as my son Cunningham put it, collectively, humanity is a bevy of adolescent teenagers desiring to grow up and fighting it at the same time. It all relates back to humanity's origin story. Baha'u'llah and Baha'is believe, Baha'u'llah has taught us and Baha'is believe that humanity as a collective is coming of age, as Bayan read in his opening passage. Baha'u'llah has appeared to humanity in this period of its adolescence, when it is in need of maturation. He has provided the means for establishing the unity of humankind, the hallmark of a mature world. But this has not come out of the blue. It is something we have been being prepared for over the millennia. Through the process of what Baha'is call progressive revelation, God has been guiding us to this very turning point in the maturation of human society. This is directly related to the earlier point about each educator from God bringing us two sets of teachings, the eternal and the changing. Both these sets of teachings are aimed at helping humanity achieve its collective maturity. That this day would come was foretold. Isaiah spoke about it in magical detail. Christ's only known prayer speaks of it. Jewish tradition, Tikkun Olam, alludes to it. Black Elk's vision of the world as a hoop symbolizing the future of world unity. So the vision of the collective maturation of humanity has long been with us. Like any loving and wise parent, God has given us a vision of our future, our destiny of maturity, and the many virtues it requires, the essential and unchanging teachings. And while we are growing towards that maturity, the rules that govern our individual and collective lives are relevant to our stage of growth. Two children in the same family, one a preschool child and one an adolescent, will both be given the same vision about what it means to be an adult. But the rules they are expected to follow are relevant for their stages of development. The preschool child is not expected to manage their time for the family, whereas this will most likely be expected of the adolescent. A preschool child will not be allowed to go about unaccompanied, whereas an adolescent will have a greater degree of freedom. So it has been with humanity. as a collective. We have been lovingly but firmly nurtured towards the realization of our destiny to come of age. Next slide. So the question is, what will humanity's collective coming of age look like? Next slide. In the Baha'i perspective, humanity's coming of age signifies a momentous shift in the consciousness, or in consciousness, where we collectively awaken to our true potential and interconnectedness. Just as an individual matures from adolescence to adulthood, humanity is now transitioning from its turbulent adolescence, marked by conflict and ignorance, to an era of maturity characterized by unity, harmony, and enlightenment. Note that our adolescence is turbulent and that the transition is marked by conflict and ignorance. Elsewhere in the Baha'i writings, the Baha'i writings refer to the process as slow and painful. This goes a long way to explain what the world is going through right now. The Baha'i teachings note the tumult of this age of transition is characteristic of the impetuosity and irrational instincts of youth, its follies, its prodigality, its pride, its self-assurance, its rebelliousness, and its contempt of discipline. Next slide. The Baha'i teachings also state the convulsions of this transitional and most turbulent period in the annals of humanity are the essential prerequisites and herald the inevitable approach of that age of ages in which the folly and tumults of strife that has since the dawn of history blackened the annals of mankind will have been finally transmuted into the wisdom and the tranquility of an undisturbed, a universal, a lasting peace in which the discord and separation of the children of men will have given way to the worldwide reconciliation and the complete unification of the diverse elements that constitute human society. It's a picture we have of where we're going. Next slide. Baha'i teachings anticipate that the process of integration that has led us through an ever-expanding scales of human organization from the family to the nation states will continue to operate until it culminates in the unification of the whole world. The final object and crowning glory of human evolution on this planet. It is the stage which humanity willingly or unwillingly is resistlessly approaching. Next slide. It is for this stage, the Baha'i teachings state further, that this fiery ordeal which humanity is experiencing is mysteriously paving the way. And to me, this explains why we see such chaos around the world. We are being dragged to the altar of unity. While we say we want it, we fear the cost, and so we resist. We fight it. We fight those with whom we are meant to become united. We throw our toys out of the cot, and we stamp our feet, and we bewail the loss of the comforts of our child-age life. Like a man or woman who's spent their youth carefree and accountable to no one but him or himself, now facing the reality of marriage. Oh, while they want it, but oh, what a price. Unable to see the massive benefits of two becoming one, resistance sets in. Next slide. Growing up is indeed hard to do. And the changes required of us as adults are impressive. They are even more impressive when applied to the whole of humanity. And the aim of this discussion is to consider the implications of the coming of age from the perspective of individuals, communities, and institutions. But even with such an elegant framework, there are just so many ways to look at this phenomenon. Next slide. So I was thinking that we could look at it from the perspective of being and doing. As we come of age, how are we meant to be? And what are we meant to do? So let's start with the individual. We start here because that's where growing up starts. Baha'u'llah sets the standard very high. And there are many standards. How does Baha'u'llah expect us to be as mature adults? As time is short, we'll look at just a few. Next slide. Baha'u'llah says, my first counsel is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart. This is his first counsel. The inner condition is abstractly clear. That inside I should have a pure heart, a kindly heart, a radiant heart. But what does a pure, kindly, and radiant heart look like in action? Next slide. Well, Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah and his successor, put it rather succinctly. He said, let your heart burn with love and kindness for all who may cross your path. It's easy to apply this to people who like us, but it would take a real adult to apply it to people who position themselves as an enemy or a competitor. Next slide. Baha'u'llah says, regard ye not one another as strangers. In practice, that's a challenge. I know that in the United States, you have issues regarding foreigners. We have them here as well. And yet, we also know from the teachings of the Bible that are very clear that say when a foreigner comes, you must treat them as your neighbor. So this has been around for a long time. In practice, it's a challenge. Next slide. The Baha'i writings ask us to be loving fathers to the orphan, and a refuge to the helpless, a treasury for the poor, a cure for the ailing. Be the helpers of the victim, or of every victim of oppression, the patrons of the disadvantaged. Again, some very challenging standards for us to uphold as adults on an individual level. Next slide. Abdul Baha also says, think ye at all times of rendering some service to every member of the human race. Pay ye no heed to aversion and rejection, to disdain, hostility, injustice. Act ye in the opposite way. Be ye sincerely kind, not in appearance only. Let each one of God's loved ones center his attention on this, to be the Lord's mercy to man, to be the Lord's grace. Let him do some good to every person whose path he crosseth, and be of some benefit to him. Let him improve the character of each and all, and reorient the minds of men. This is quite a challenge again, to do some good to every person whose path he crosseth. And we all cross the path of many people every day. So the standard is set very high for us to behave in a way that strangers, friends, people who perceive us as enemies, we should try to do some good to every person who crosses our path. Next slide. Baha'u'llah said, blessed is he who preferreth his brother before himself. And when you think about adolescence, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge, because it means you might have to give up something that you want. You're a sportsman, you might want to beat that other guy. If you are a student, you might want to become the best student in the class and beat everybody. Or you want to be chosen. Long ago, one of my sons was interviewed by to join a boys' school. After the interview, the principal told me they were going to offer him a place. And then he explained the reason why. He said, academically, your son is fine. But during the interview, we asked him why we should give the space to him and not to another boy. Your son asked about this other boy. So we made up a story about him, about a boy who was not as academically capable as your son, but who had few choices about schooling and faced other challenges. Your son said, then I think you should give the space to him. He needs it more than I do. Your son never said a word about why he should be chosen over the other boy, only that we should give the space to the other boy. To me, that's manifesting being in doing, in preferring his brother to himself. High standard, because it was a good school. Next slide. Baha'u'llah tells us to be a preserver of the sanctity of thy pledge, to be fair in thy judgment, and guarded in thy speech, to be worthy of the trust of thy neighbor, and look upon him with a bright and friendly face. These are fairly straightforward. But how easy is it to be a preserver of the sanctity of your pledge, a promise that you've made? We are often taught in the Baha'i faith that truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues, and that when you say, I'll be somewhere at a time, you might be telling the truth at the time, and then life intervenes, and you don't arrive on time. And so have you preserved the sanctity of your pledge? Have you walked a path of truth as much as you've spoken a path of truth? And being fair in your judgment and guarded in your speech. Tough challenge. And being worthy of the trust of your neighbor and look upon him with a bright and friendly face. What if your neighbor is unkind or even mean? Next slide. Well, of course, Baha'u'llah doesn't let us off the hook on that. He says, they who dwell within the tabernacle of God and are established upon the seats of everlasting glory will refuse, though they be dying of hunger, to stretch their hands and seize unlawfully the property of their neighbor, however vile and worthless he may be. So even when we have a vile and worthless neighbor, and they have a nice fruit that they're not eating from their tree, we still do not stretch our hands and seize that without his permission. These are high standards. And I come from a country where there's a high level of poverty and a high level of hunger. And Baha'u'llah has addressed this country. Though they be dying of hunger, they will not stretch their hands and seize unlawfully the property of their neighbor. Next slide. A key aspect of being an adult is being just. Baha'u'llah says, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom. By its aid, thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. This puts an end to gossip. This puts an end to jumping to conclusions before you have all the facts. And it demands that we do gather facts and not rely only on the word of others. Tough challenge in the society that we live in. Next slide. I think, in short, coming of age on the individual level really is about living up to the standards God has set for us as human beings across eternity, to rise above the world of the animal, the material world, and soar in the realm of the kingdom of humanity, striving daily to translate the many counsels given by God into practice. And then, each day to bring ourselves to account to help us stay on an ever-advancing track. And that's a really adult thing to do, not to say, the devil made me do it, or it was my friend's fault, or, I'm just a kid. The idea of being an adult is striving to live up to these standards, bringing yourself to account and owning the progress or lack of progress that you've made. Next slide. So now let's see how communities demonstrate maturity. There are many beautiful and inspiring passages in the writings of Baha'u'llah that speak of the collective behavior of humanity. Next slide. Baha'u'llah says, consort with all men, O people of Baha, in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. So he's asking us to consort with all men in a spirit of friendship, friendliness, and fellowship. All men. Not just the ones we like, not just the ones that are easy to talk to, not just the ones who smell nice or look nice or do nice things, but to consort with all men in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. So when we get together in a group, as a community, as a collective, everybody in that room, everybody in that space, everybody in that school hall, everybody at that town meeting, everybody at that church gathering, everybody at the zoo, we should consort with them in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship so that everybody feels welcome and everybody feels a part of the whole. Next slide. Baha'u'llah says that the All-Merciful hath created humankind for the adornment of this contingent world, so that men may array the earth with the manifold blessings of heaven, that the inner reality of the human being may, like unto a lamp of the spirit, cause the community of man to become as a mirror for the assemblage on high. So there's our standard. There's our standard. So that the inner reality of the human being, that's you and me and everybody else, like unto a lamp of the spirit, cause the community of man to become a mirror for the assemblage on high. What's that assemblage on high? Depending on your belief system, we all should have some kind of an idea about, that should create some kind of an image in our heads of some kind of heavenly concept. I mean, is not the kingdom of God on earth a heavenly concept that helps us see that we want to mirror the assemblage on high? And here's the standard when you get together with your friends, or you get together with people who might be strangers. Are you like unto a lamp of the spirit that causes this community to become the mirror for the assemblage on high? It's a pretty demanding ask. Next slide. I would like, however, as beautiful as those thoughts are, I'd like to focus on two things that are of particular importance in the Baha'i teachings about how the community works. One is the equality of women and men, and the other is the way the economy should work. In brief, a mature community will embrace every aspect of the fundamental reality of the equality of the sexes. It is, for us, something of a no-brainer, although it, in practice, seems to be hard to practice, but it should be a no-brainer that if you do not have equality between the genders, between the sexes, then you're perpetuating injustice on more than 50% of the population. So unity becomes impossible. The Baha'i teachings imply that a mature community will recognize the necessity for the equality of the sexes. And about this, Abdu'l-Baha is particularly clear. Next slide. He says, until the reality of equality between man and woman is fully established and attained, the highest social development of mankind is not possible. Until these two members are equal in strength, the oneness of humanity cannot be established, and the happiness and felicity of mankind will not be a reality. That's pretty emphatic. That until we see this equality, the highest social development of mankind is not possible. And we're seeing that. And until these two members are equal in strength, the oneness of humanity cannot be established, and the happiness and felicity of mankind will not be a reality. To me, the implication is the bulwark of patriarchal systems and behavior must come down. Men must yield their sole grip on power, social power, political power, economic power. Get to that altar and stop with the cold feet and the fear of giving it up, because the unity is more powerful than the lack of unity. Next slide. On the issue of the way the economy should work, Abdu'l-Baha speaks a lot about economics. And he's equally clear about this. Essentially, he indicates that a mature society is one in which ensures the right of every human being to the daily bread whereby they exist, or the equalization of the means of livelihood. While laws will be in place, he says, the collective will not tolerate anyone living in extreme poverty while others live in great wealth. It is a society in which the wealthy recognize the advantages of moderation in the acquisition of profits and show regard for the welfare of the poor and the needy. And they do this voluntarily. So we get an idea of how the collective society works on an economic level. Next slide. It is a mature community is one where all are committed to the realization that all members of the body politic may enjoy through the working out of the solution the greatest happiness, welfare, and comfort without any harm or injury attacking the general order of things. That to all members of the body politic shall be given the greatest achievements of the world of humanity. Each one shall have the utmost welfare and being. From my perspective, this is a community that cares for everyone in the community, where if a family is unable to afford to educate their children, the community steps up to ensure they get educated. Where if a family falls on hard times, a system exists to ensure their survival. Next slide. And the concept of community will appear at all levels: neighborhood, village, city, country, region, world. Baha'u'llah says clearly, the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. To achieve this will require national communities to cede certain rights and privileges to the greater whole, where competition between economies disappears, where instead of us versus them, it's all just us. It will mean nations giving up their strike-back ability. Nations will be required to reduce their arms to only that which is required for internal order. And that's a tall order, considering the way things are at the moment. And yet it will come. However, Abdu'l-Baha does say that all nations must disarm at the same time. It will not do it all, he says. And it is not proposed that some nations shall lay down their arms while others, their neighbors, remain armed. The peace of the world must be brought about by international agreement. All nations must agree to disarm simultaneously. So, as a world community, that's a big step we still have yet to take. Next slide. Another key element of the coming of age of humanity, and one which is quite controversial, I think, is a common language. Baha'u'llah is also quite specific about this. In his most holy book, Baha'u'llah has enjoined the selection of a single language and the adoption of a common script for all the earth to use. He affirmed that when this was carried out, it would be one of the signs of the coming of age of the human race. Imagine the level of maturity required for all the people of the world to adopt a single language, representing as it does culture, identity, the reclaiming of space invaded by colonists. I'm sure even as I say these words, some of you are thinking that this is unconscionable. It sounds like we are wiping out culture. And yet, this is the crux of it. What is our true identity? As old adolescents ask, who am I? Who are we? Is it our ethnicity, our heritage, our nationality? Baha'u'llah seems to be saying that yes, in our stage as children, we use such devices to identify ourselves. But now, as we emerge into maturity, we must realign our identity to something much, much greater. Our true identity as that being created in the image of God. In a marriage, do not a wife and husband need to develop a common language without which the marriage will not last? So we're marrying as a world. We need a common language. Next slide. So we finally come to institutions. Institutions are effectively an extension of individuals and community, and there's a number of aspects related to institutions coming of age. Next slide. Starting with no priests. Baha'u'llah has said that we've now passed the need for priests. We are no longer children who need someone to tell us what to think about what God says. In his teachings, it seems the focus of institutions is on governance and service rather than on power and control. And so the idea that someone up there at the front of the room controls how we think about what God said has to go, because that's what we needed when we were children, but it is not what we need now. Everyone is expected to learn to read and write and to delve into the Word of God and to formulate his or her own understanding. This is a key aspect of independent investigation of truth that we spoke about earlier. Thus, the focus of institutions is on governance and service rather than on power and control. Institutions will seek to foster unity and collaboration, ensure the well-being of all those whom they govern, emancipate the mind, ensure the possibility of every person reaching their potential socially, spiritually, materially. And thus the purpose and function of institutions serving a humanity that has come of age is just that, service. It is not about power. Still a long way to go in our world. Next slide. Sorry, I think you might have to go 2 slides on that one. It seems to be a repeat. Related to this, Baha'u'llah said one of the signs of maturity, of the world, is that no one will accept to bear the weight of kingship. Kingship will remain, with none willing to bear it alone its weight. That day will be the day whereon wisdom will be manifested among mankind. This seems to imply that no one would actively seek office, no one would desire power, no one would contest the outcome of electoral processes. Emphasis is placed on the integrity of the electoral system, and more importantly, on the independence of the voters and preserving his right to vote according to his conscience. Can you imagine a world in which no one will willingly bear the weight of the crown alone? No one would be willing to accept to bear the weight of kingship. Very far from where we are right now. Next slide. Abdu'l-Baha also indicates that the decision-making bodies must operate on unity. He says the first condition is absolute love and harmony amongst the members of the assembly. They must be wholly free from estrangement. Consider the institutions around the world that make decisions about how we live our lives. We have stories here in South Africa. We have amazing stories about the goings on in our parliament. And it is based on anything but love and harmony and unity. It's based on adversarial behavior, on competition and desire to beat the other person. Next slide. Abdu'l-Baha goes on to say they must proceed with the utmost devotion, courtesy, dignity, care, and moderation to express their views. Imagine. They must in every matter search out the truth and not insist upon their own opinion. For stubbornness and persistence in one's views would lead ultimately to discord and wrangling, and the truth will remain hidden. And he goes on at some length to explain things like setting out your thoughts with moderation, that you must not belittle the thought of another, and not to object or censure the final decision that's made. And that if you do this, the result is light. But should there be estrangement, the result will be darkness upon darkness. Kind of fits where we're at the moment. Still in our adolescent stage, eh? Next slide. And he sets a very high standard for consultation. He says it must have, a consultation must have for its object the investigation of truth. And he who expresses an opinion should not voice it as correct, and rights, but set it forth as a contribution to the conscious consensus of opinion. For the light of reality becomes apparent when two opinions coincide. And he goes on to tell us that we should, before expressing our own views, listen carefully to the other views already advanced. And if they are more true and worthy, then I should accept it and immediately and not willfully hold on to my opinion. Again, a big ask for institutions. He says, therefore, true consultation is spiritual conference in the attitude and atmosphere of love. Members must love each other in the spirit of fellowship in order that good results may be forthcoming. Love and fellowship are the foundation. Next slide. And that brings us to the last piece in our exploration on this topic of humanity's coming of age, the way forward. Next slide. Baha'i writings say the ages of humanity's infancy and childhood are past, never again to return. While the great age, the consummation of all ages, which must signalize the coming of age of the entire human race, is yet to come. So we're in the transition. Our infancy, childhood is past. Our maturity is yet to come. So we're still in that adolescent stage. Next slide. The convulsions of this transitional and most turbulent period are the essential prerequisites and herald the inevitable approach of that age of ages in which the folly and tumult of strife will have been finally transmuted into the wisdom and tranquility of an undisturbed, a universal and lasting peace. We read this earlier, in which the discord and separation of the children of men will have given way to the worldwide reconciliation and the complete unification of the diverse elements that constitute human society. So these convulsions are essential prerequisites. We need to go through what we're going through. Next slide. There was a statement published on Baha'u'llah some years ago. I've taken this from there. It says the chief instrument for the transformation of society and the achievement of world unity is the establishment of justice in the affairs of humankind. And the subject of justice has a central place in Baha'u'llah's teachings. He says the light of men is justice. Quench it not with contrary wind of oppression and tyranny. The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity amongst men. So if we go back one slide, we see that we have to go through this period of convulsions and turbulence as an essential prerequisite. Go forward to the next slide. But we need to start working on establishing justice in the world, because without justice, we cannot have unity. Next slide. Baha'u'llah asserts, and the advancement of civilization requires that society so organize its sphere to give full expression to the equality of women and men. That's a prerequisite, as we said before. Baha'u'llah asserts the advancement of civilization requires that society so organize its, I've repeated myself. We can skip that one, go to the next slide. Baha'i teachings tell us the earth's resources are the property of all humanity, not of any one people. Different contributions to the common economic welfare deserve and should receive different measures of reward and recognition, but the extremes of wealth and poverty, which afflict most nations on earth, regardless of the socioeconomic philosophies they profess, must be abolished. So we now have these four things that we can look at. We have to go through this turbulent stage. We must establish justice. We must establish the equality of women and men. And we must abolish the extremes of wealth and poverty and recognize that the earth's resources are the property of all humanity, not of just any one people. Next slide. At the heart of this system that we're speaking about was what Baha'u'llah termed a new covenant between God and humankind. This is an interesting concept. The distinguishing feature of humanity's coming of age is that for the first time in history, the entire human race is consciously involved, however dimly, in the awareness of its own oneness and of the earth as a single homeland. This awakening opens the way to a new relationship between God and humankind. As the peoples of the world embrace the spiritual authority inherent in the guidance of the revelation of God for this age, Baha'u'llah said, they will find in themselves a moral empowerment which human effort alone has proven incapable of generating. So this is now the fifth point, is that this is not just going to be something we do through political means, through a sudden emotional awakening. This has to do with going right back to what we started with, the two kinds of lessons coming from God, the eternal and the changing, that if we don't bring those into our lives, we're not going to be able to bring about the successful maturation of humanity. Next slide. And he predicts a new race of men will emerge as a result of this relationship, and the work of building a global civilization will begin. So we must go through the tumult. We must establish justice. We must establish the equality of women and men. We must abolish the extremes of wealth and poverty. We must recognize that all the earth's resources belong to everyone. We must remember that the only way we can do this is through following God's teachings. And from that, when we commit ourselves to the individual coming of age and the community coming of age, which will lead to the institutional coming of age, we will get a new race of men. And then we can build the global civilization. Next slide. Goes on to say the task of creating a global development strategy that will accelerate humanity's coming of age constitutes a challenge to reshape fundamentally all the institutions of society. The protagonists to whom the challenge addresses itself are all of the inhabitants of the planet, not just a select few, but all of the inhabitants of the planet, the generality of humankind, members of governing institutions at all levels, persons serving in agencies of international coordination, scientists, social thinkers, all those endowed with artistic talents or with access to the media of communication, and leaders of non-governmental organizations. Everyone must be a protagonist. Next slide. All of this is based on an unconditioned recognition of the oneness of humankind, a commitment to the establishment of justice as the organizing principle of society, and a determination to exploit to the utmost the possibilities that a system of dialogue between the scientific and religious communities of the race can bring, religious genius of the race can bring to the building of human capacity. So we have these three sort of imperatives: recognition of the oneness of humankind, establishing justice, and recognizing that there should not be this battle between the genius and scientific and religious genius, and let them come together, and that will help us build human capacity. Next slide, please. Requires a radical rethinking of most of the concepts and assumptions currently governing social and economic life. And you can think about how we order our lives in most societies around the world. They're based on a set of assumptions that really need to be reviewed. It must be wedded as well to a conviction that however long the process and whatever setbacks may be encountered, the governance of human affairs can be conducted along the lines that serve humanity's real needs. Next slide. So that brings me to the end. As you can see, this is a vast topic, and I hope I've given you at least some glimpse of the implications of humanity's coming of age for individuals, the communities, and for institutions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Worth, for your talk. I really, really enjoyed it. We already have a couple questions. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out. So firstly, our question asks, in the case of donating money to various good causes, should we, unless funds are not an issue, contribute to these charities, projects, or other causes, or donate first to the faith? There are many different funds in the faith.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it's a personal choice, and I think what might be a better way is not to dichotomize the thinking on that. That right now, the way the Baha'i faith is operating is that we are looking for partnerships. We're looking for collaborations. We have recognized and made very clear, our Universal House of Justice has made very clear, we're not going to build this unified world on our own. We're not an NGO that's reaching out. We're a faith of God. And so whether you contribute money or not, you can decide. But the question is, how engaged are you with these agencies in a real way? How much time and energy are you putting in bringing to them the vision of Baha'u'llah and these concepts of equality and men and women and of justice and of recognizing it's going to be okay. This is our transitional period. Recognizing, instilling the spiritual aspects of development over the material aspects of development. And then if it comes along that they need you to help, your help will be much more directed in a specific way. So sure, I mean, people think donate to the World Wildlife Fund. I donate to the World Wildlife Fund. My son is a great environmentalist. I couldn't dare not, But on the other hand, I work a lot in my neighborhood, and I live right next door to a really poor neighborhood. And so we have kids over at the house all the time. We help them with their homework. We contribute to school funds. We get involved. So I would suggest don't think of it as a choice between, but what is the coherent response? And if you're contributing, what is that contribution doing, and how genuine is it, and what impact is it having, and how aligned is the work of what that agency is doing to these principles that Baha'u'llah has brought? And if they're aligned, well, find ways to support them, even if it isn't money. There's a lovely letter from the Universal House of Justice, and I think the Office of Social Development, about collaboration in working with people who are not Baha'is, but who have many wonderful things to bring to the advancement of society that we, as I said, we just read, bring the genius of science and religion together. And so it isn't really a matter of the dichotomous, should I, shouldn't I? It's how can I be involved in this whole process, and at what level, I think.
Thank you. Our next question asks, how can we eliminate the extremes of wealth and poverty in a world that sees accumulation of wealth and some aspects of capitalism that feeds into it as the right of every individual?
Well, we first of all, we need to remember that God has never asked us to be poor. He's told us that we mustn't fear poverty, and that blessed are the poor, and that it's easier for the poor to enter the kingdom of heaven. We recognize that poverty exists, but we don't say, hey, my goal is to be poor. We are very much aligned with of a coherent spiritual and material prosperous life, right? And so we want to see people advance materially, and we want to see them advance spiritually together. Abdu'l-Baha gives warning after warning of the danger of advancing materially without advancing spiritually. And so again, it's not a dichotomous thing. And we need to recognize that the solution to the world's economic problems and the extremes of wealth and poverty is the spiritualization of the planet. We need to bring people back to the original teachings of God that have been going along, those unchanging teachings of God since the time of Adam and Abraham, about our role in this world, and bringing the spiritual values. So if you're looking for an instant answer, there isn't one, because the greed and avarice of mankind is great. Materialism is tremendous. The powers of making you become materialistic are huge. And yet we know from the teachings of Baha'u'llah himself, the only solution to this is turning back to the Word of God, which has its own creative power, and that when we begin, as he says, to unlock the hearts, the gate to the door of the human heart, that then, where that stranger, Baha'u'llah says that, I went to your heart and I found a stranger there, chase him out. When we've unlocked that door and we've allowed this fresh understanding of the value of God's teachings into our lives, then slowly, people will begin to shift their values. I have a friend here, his name is Sandile Masondo. He's been studying the faith for many years. And he's so inspired. He says, he keeps telling me he's poor. I actually think he's quite wealthy, but anyway, he starts businesses with the sole purpose of creating jobs. So he manages, he says, his latest business is he's built and he rents out trailers, and his goal, he'll make some money. He said, but his goal is to employ 15 people permanently. And once that's established, he'll leave that running and then he'll go start another business to employ another 15 people. And you should see his house is very modest. It's very simple. So here's an example of how you can slowly allow the spirit of this idea of extremes of wealth and poverty to permeate the economic decisions. There is a lovely letter from the House of Justice that speaks about our economic choices and how we need to align our economic choices with our spiritual realities. So there is no short-term answer except to keep plugging away at opening the hearts and minds of men to these concepts, that they are destined as a human being for this spiritual next world, and that they need to prepare for it, and that this material stuff isn't going to be around. So don't stress. It's going to take a long time, but we have to keep at this awakening of the hearts of men to this, and women. I mean, he uses men in that terrible English way.
Thank you. Our next question asks, will there be anything left after the convulsions of climate change, loss of ecosystems, and 60% of species? Will adolescents leave the future humans with a battered and depleted world?
No. Yes and no. I mean, of course. In fact, the guardian of the Baha'i faith is quite specific about this, and he says it's one of the reasons that we are trying to do what we're trying to do. Most religions haven't worked as hard as the Baha'i faith has worked to be everywhere and be involved in everything. The most either pick a place to be, or they become closed in and they sort of serve themselves. Or they stay in a particular line, like get involved in politics, or they get involved in community service. The Baha'i community, under the guidance of the House of Justice, is everywhere. It's involved in government policy, it's involved in schools, it's involved in the lives of individuals, it's involved in nature conservation, it's involved in agriculture, and it's everywhere in the world. And the Guardian makes it really clear that one of the reasons we're doing this is to ensure that when this thing happens, and we don't know what this thing is or to what extent it's going to be, that there will be enough around to pick up the pieces. But that mankind will arrive at this age is, of course, I mean, this is the ultimate promise of God. I mean, we've had this wonderful story of Isaiah, we have the promise of Christ, we have, every religion has talked about this. So absolutely, it may not be easy, but post-apocalyptic, which by the way is a really bad term, because if you look that up, it doesn't mean what the movies have made it mean. But the post-convulsions will be, remember, we're going to have the lesser peace. So it will come, or cause, if it doesn't come with it, it'll cause us to say, hey, we got to work on this together going forward. So yeah, I'm quite confident that there'll be enough of us and enough land and enough people to rebuild. Will it be easy? No. It'll be easier if we can get more work done. It'll be harder if we sit back and think, I'd rather watch TV.
Then I want to thank you again, Dr. Worth, for your talk. These questions, also just hearing your insight in these topics is really, I think, useful for all of us. So thank you a lot.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, as I say, this was a somewhat new territory for me, and I'm grateful to my son, who is he's been trained in psychology, so he has a little bit of insight into these things that I didn't have. But I do think that I am grateful for this, because it's helped me realize some things that I need to be thinking about, and I hope that this has started a conversation in your minds and amongst others in your community, not to lose hope about the future, not to be overly concerned about what is happening in the world. I know we're all stressed about Ukraine. We're all now very concerned about Hawaii. If you live in Africa, we're concerned about just about everything, because we have problems everywhere. I would recommend to you two things. Three things now that I think of it. One is to read that letter from the House of Justice on economics. A second is to read the letter, I think it's November 2022, to the Baha'is of Congo. It's a really interesting expose on where the world is going, and traditions and unity and identity. And the third one has escaped me, so I'll have to remember what it was later. But there is ample guidance to us on seeing our way through all of this, and recognizing that it really is up to us, starting with the individual, which will lead to the community, which will lead to the transformation of institutions.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So now I will introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker next week is going to be Mr. Chase Foster, and his topic is How Becoming a Baha'i Changed My Life. And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so please invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, again, you can fill out the Google form that I'll put in the chat. And now we're going to end with a song, a Baha'i song.
Before you end with the song, you gotta listen to Chase's story. That's a must read. This guy is amazing. So please, tune in.
Yeah, looking forward to it next week.
Yeah, definitely. He's a good guy.
Thank you again for everyone for joining. Thank you again, Dr. Worth. Hope to see you all next week. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.